Hello and welcome to our video on the worst serial killers of all time. Today we will take a closer look at some of the most notorious and vile killers that have ever walked the earth. These individuals have caused unimaginable pain and suffering to their victims and their families. We will examine their lives, their crimes, and the impact they had on society. So, buckle up and get ready for a chilling ride. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy is one of the most infamous serial killers in history. He murdered at least 30 young women in the 1970s. Bundy was a charming and attractive man who used his good looks and intelligence to lure his victims to their deaths. He would often feign injury, such as a broken arm, to gain their sympathy and trust. Once they were close enough, he would attack them and then sexually assault and kill them. Bundy's heinous crimes shocked the nation and he became one of the most reviled killers of all time. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, is another notorious serial killer. He murdered 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. Dahmer was known for his brutal acts of cannibalism and necrophilia. He would often keep the bodies of his victims in his apartment, where he would perform gruesome acts on them. Dahmer's crimes shocked the world and he was eventually sentenced to life in prison, where he was murdered by a fellow inmate in 1994. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy, also known as the Killer Clown, was a serial killer who murdered at least 33 young men and boys between 1972 and 1978. Gacy was a well-known community leader and businessman who used his position of authority to lure his victims to his home. He would often dress up as a clown to entertain children at local events, which is how he earned his nickname. Gacy's crimes shocked the nation and he was eventually executed by lethal injection in 1994. Andrei Chikatilo. Andrei Chikatilo, also known as the Butcher of Rostov, was a Soviet serial killer who murdered at least 52 women and children between 1978 and 1990. Chikatilo was known for his extreme violence and brutality. He would often mutilate his victims and eat their sexual organs. Chikatilo's crimes terrorized the Soviet Union and he was eventually executed in 1994. Harold Shipman. Harold Shipman, also known as Dr. Death, was a British physician who murdered at least 215 of his patients between 1975 and 1998. Shipman was known for administering lethal doses of drugs to his patients, many of whom were elderly women. He would often forge their wills to make himself the beneficiary of their estates. Shipman's crimes shocked the medical community and he was eventually sentenced to life in prison, where he committed suicide in 2004. Gary Ridgway. Gary Ridgway, also known as the Green River Killer, was a serial killer who murdered at least 49 women in Washington state between 1982 and 2001. Ridgway was known for his methodical approach to killing and his ability to evade capture for many years. He would often dump his victims' bodies in remote areas, which made it difficult for authorities to find them. Ridgway's crimes shocked the nation and he was eventually sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos was a female serial killer who murdered at least 7 men in Florida between 1989 and 1990. Wuornos was a prostitute and claimed that her victims had raped or attempted to rape her, which led her to kill them in self-defense. However, evidence suggests that her motives may have been more financial than defensive. Wuornos was eventually caught and sentenced to death, which she received in 2002. Pedro Alonso Lopez. Pedro Alonso Lopez is a Colombian serial killer who is believed to have murdered at least 300 young girls and women in the 1970s and 1980s. Lopez was known for his brutal acts of violence and sexual assault. He would often lure his victims away from their families and then strangle them to death. Lopez was eventually caught by police in Ecuador and sentenced to life in prison, where he remains to this day. Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker, was a serial killer who murdered at least 13 people in California in the mid-1980s. Ramirez was known for his gruesome acts of violence, which included rape, torture, and murder. He would often break into his victims' homes and attack them in the middle of the night. Ramirez was eventually caught and sentenced to death, which he received in 2013. Albert Fish. Albert Fish is one of the most depraved serial killers in history. He murdered at least 3 children in the early 20th century and was known for his sadistic acts of violence and cannibalism. Fish would often send letters to the parents of his victims, detailing the gruesome acts he had committed. He was eventually caught and sentenced to death, which he received in 1936. Robert Pickton. Robert Pickton, also known as the Pig Farmer Killer, was a Canadian serial killer who murdered at least 6 women in the 1990s and early 2000s. Pickton was a pig farmer who would lure his victims to his property, where he would murder them and then dispose of their bodies by feeding them to his pigs. He was eventually caught and sentenced to life in prison. Peter Sutcliffe. Peter Sutcliffe, also known as the Yorkshire Ripper, was a British serial killer who murdered at least 13 women and attacked several others between 1975 and 1980. Sutcliffe would often target sex workers and brutally attack them with a hammer or knife. He was eventually caught and sentenced to life in prison. David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz, also known as the Son of Sam, was an American serial killer who murdered at least 6 people and wounded several others in New York City between 1976 and 1977. Berkowitz claimed that he was commanded to kill by a demon that possessed his neighbor's dog. He was eventually caught and sentenced to life in prison. Conclusion. In conclusion, the world has seen some truly heinous serial killers over the years. These individuals have caused unimaginable pain and suffering to their victims and their families. The impact of their crimes on society has been profound, and their names will go down in history as some of the worst monsters to ever walk the earth. While we can never fully understand what drove these individuals to commit such horrific acts, it is important to remember their victims and the families left behind. We must continue to work towards preventing such atrocities from happening in the future.